She trusted her maid with everything, her home, her food, even her life. But what if the very meals she ate were laced with something unimaginable? The truth hiding in her kitchen will leave you terrified. Stay till the end to uncover the chilling secret. At the center of a thriving town stood the home of Madame Adan, a woman of grace and wisdom whose name carried weight in both business and charity. She was known for her sharp mind, her kind heart, and the way she balanced modern success with the traditions of her ancestors. Despite her wealth, Adan was not a woman of excess. She lived simply, treating her workers with dignity and ensuring that her household remained a place of harmony. Those who worked under her roof often spoke of her fairness, her generosity, and the quiet strength with which she handled life's burdens. For 5 years, Juba, the young maid, had been a trusted presence in Adan's home. She moved with the silence of a shadow, never raising her voice, never demanding more than what was given. To those outside the house, she was merely another servant, but to Madame Adan she was almost like family, loyal, reliable, and always present. Chief Naji, Adan's husband, was a man of status. His name opened doors, his presence commanded respect, but his duties often took him away for weeks at a time. Adan, accustomed to his absences, found comfort in the routine of her home, in the loyalty of her workers, and in the quiet rhythm of life. But beneath the surface there were whispers. "Juba is different," the market women would murmur. "Have you noticed? She speaks little, but her eyes see too much." The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, wondering why Juba never mingled with the other servants, why she was always the one to serve Madame Adan her food, and why, despite her lowly position, she carried herself with an air that was almost possessive. One evening, as Adan sat at the table, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The room tilted slightly, her fingers trembling as she reached for her cup. It had been happening more frequently, this strange weakness that crept into her bones, the exhaustion that clung to her no matter how much she rested. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Perhaps I am just tired," she murmured to herself. In the kitchen, the cook grumbled under her breath. "Juba again," she muttered, watching as the younger woman carried the tray of food to Madame's quarters. "She never lets me serve. Always. Her, always careful, like she owns the right." A new housekeeper, just a few days into the job, frowned at the cook's words. "Why does she insist on it?" The cook lowered her voice. "I don't know, but it is strange, isn't it? She barely eats from the same pot. And do you know what happened to the last girl, the one before you?" The housekeeper shook her head. "She left without a word, just packed her things and vanished. But before she walked out that door, she turned to me and said, 'Never eat from this house.'" The housekeeper's breath hitched. "What did she mean?" The cook shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, Juba knows." In the quiet of her room, Madame Adan took another sip of her soup, her mind drifting. She had always trusted Juba, always believed in the goodness of those she welcomed into her home. But trust, like a house, is only as strong as the foundation it stands on. And sometimes the cracks remain hidden until it is too late. Chief Naji had always been a man of presence. When he spoke, his voice carried weight, and when he entered a room, heads turned in respect. But lately, something had changed. His once attentive eyes no longer lingered on Adan the way they used to. His words, once filled with warmth, had grown distant. He came home late, sometimes not at all, and when he did, he barely looked at his wife. Adan felt the shift like a cold wind pressing against her skin. She had seen the way his shoulders tensed when she spoke, the way he sighed when she asked simple questions. At night, he turned away from her, his warmth a memory rather than a comfort. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that men often became restless, that business could drain a man's spirit. But deep in her heart, she knew this was something else. Her own body had begun to betray her. A deep tiredness settled in her bones, one that no amount of rest could shake. Her skin, once smooth and glowing, now seemed dull, almost lifeless. Her appetite wavered, yet at odd moments she craved strange things, food she had never desired before, the saltier, the better. Sometimes she caught herself licking her lips after meals, searching for a taste she could not quite name. The housekeeper, an observant woman with sharp instincts, had noticed something peculiar. Juba never ate from the same pot she served, Madam. While the others would scoop from the communal dishes, Juba always had her own separate meal. Quietly, she watched, questions forming in her mind but left unspoken. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the housekeeper stepped outside to fetch water. Her eyes caught movement near the back of the compound. There, in the fading light, she saw Juba standing with a strange woman, their heads close together. The woman, wrapped in a dark cloth, whispered something into Juba's ear before pressing a small red bundle into her hands. Juba nodded, clutching the cloth as if it held something precious. The housekeeper's breath caught as she watched Juba move toward the old tree behind the house. Carefully, deliberately, Juba dug a small hole, placed the red cloth inside, and covered it with earth. When she was done, she stepped back, a small knowing smile curving her lips. Adan, unaware of the hidden act taking place outside her home, was beginning to sense something even more unsettling within herself. The seamstress, an old woman with eyes that saw more than they should, had come by to fit Adan's new garments. As she adjusted the fabric over Adan's shoulders, she frowned. The woman muttered. Adan looked up. "What is it?" The seamstress ran her fingers lightly over Adan's arm, pressing gently as if feeling for something unseen. "Your skin?" she murmured, her voice laced with something unreadable. "It is as if you are fading." Adan stiffened. "Fading?" The woman stepped back, brushing her hands against her wrapper as if ridding herself of something unseen. "Like a woman who has been feeding from another's soul." The words clung to the air long after the seamstress had gone, wrapping around Adan's thoughts like vines creeping over a forgotten house. That night, when the house had quieted and even the crickets had grown still, Adan rose from her bed. A feeling, cold and insistent, had settled deep in her chest, urging her forward. With careful steps, she moved through the darkened corridors, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. From the kitchen, a low, melodic hum drifted through the silence. The sound was soft, almost soothing, yet something about it made Adan's skin prickle. She moved closer, her bare feet silent against the floor. Peering into the dimly lit room, she saw Juba standing over a pot, stirring slowly, her lips moving in a whispered song. The thick red liquid in the pot clung to the spoon as she lifted it, letting it drip back into the swirling depths. Adan's breath caught. Juba's eyes never left the pot as she continued to stir. Her voice a low murmur, the rhythm of her movements hypnotic. And in that moment, Adan knew she had been eating something far more than food. The house had fallen into silence, but Adan's heart pounded loudly in her chest. Her breath was shallow as she remained hidden, her body pressed against the wall. Her eyes never left Juba, who moved with an eerie calmness as though she had done this 100 times before. With slow, deliberate hands, Juba crouched near the stove and reached beneath it. She pulled out a small cloth, worn and stained, the color almost unrecognizable in the dim light. But as Juba unfolded it, Adan's stomach turned violently. She recognized the fabric. It was Juba's underwear, stained with dark patches of dried menstrual blood. An intimate piece of clothing that should have been discarded long ago, yet here it was, clutched in Juba's trembling hands like a sacred relic. The realization struck her like a blow. This was not just filth. It was something far more sinister. Juba had been keeping it, using it, mixing its essence into the food she had been serving her for years. Juba's lips moved in a whisper, an incantation of words that sent a shiver up Adan's spine. With the cloth pressed against her chest, Juba reached for a small vial, its dark contents thick and sluggish as she pulled out the cork. The air seemed to thicken with an unseen force as she tilted the vial over the simmering pot, letting the deep red liquid drip into the food meant for Madame Adan. Juba's voice was barely above a whisper, but each word sent dread crawling over Adan's skin. Let her be weak, let her be silent, let her fade, and let him see only me. Adan's breath hitched. The truth hit her with such force that her knees nearly buckled. She clutched her mouth to stifle the scream rising in her throat. She had been eating Juba's blood. For how long? How many meals? How many nights had she swallowed her own downfall? Her body betrayed her, a violent sickness rising in her stomach, but there was no time to fall apart. The weight of the truth was suffocating. Behind her, a sudden gasp broke through the silence. The housekeeper. She had followed Adan into the kitchen, and now her scream tore through the air like a blade slicing through flesh. Juba's body stiffened. Her hand slipped, and the ladle fell from her fingers, clattering against the pot. The room seemed to shrink as she turned, her face pale, her secret exposed. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Then, Juba crumbled. She dropped to her knees, her body shaking, her hands gripping her dress as though trying to hold herself together. Tears spilled from her eyes, her voice breaking, "I wanted your life." Juba's sobs shook her frame, her words spilling out in broken confessions. "I wanted your husband to see me. I wanted to drain your power until you disappeared." Adan's world swayed beneath her feet. Juba's voice cracked with years of hidden jealousy, resentment, and unfulfilled longing. "You had everything. A man who loved you, a home, a name that carried weight. And me, I was nothing. A servant, a shadow in your house." Juba's head dropped, her voice barely a whisper now. "So I took it from you, little by little. My blood in your food, my power in your body. Every bite made you weaker, every sip made me stronger." The sickness inside Adan twisted like a living thing. Before she could speak, before she could gather the strength to demand answers, the heavy steps of a man filled the space. Chief Naji. He had arrived in the middle of the storm, his presence large and unshakable, but his face was something Adan had never seen before. His gaze fell upon Juba, then to the pot, then to his wife. And in that moment, he understood. Disgust settled over him like a shadow. His jaw clenched, his fists curling, but his voice, when it finally came, was quiet, deadly. "You sat at our table." His words were slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of betrayal. "And you fed us your filth." Juba flinched as though she had been struck. Her sobs turned to dry gasps, but there was no pity in the room, no mercy in the eyes that looked down at her. The air in the house was thick with something unspoken, something irreversible. The truth had been unveiled, and nothing would ever be the same again. The house that once held warmth and trust now carried the weight of betrayal. Juba stood with her head bowed, her body trembling as the weight of her own sins bore down on her. The whispers had already started. The housekeeper had run out, calling for the elders, and soon the town would know what she had done. Chief Naji's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "You will not stay another night in this house." Juba raised her head, her tear-streaked face filled with something between sorrow and desperation. "Madam, please." Her voice was hoarse, pleading. "I have nowhere to go." Adan's hands clenched at her sides, her body still weak, but her heart had never been so firm. "You should have thought of that before you placed your hands on what was never yours." The words hit Juba like a slap. The air between them held no room for mercy. Whatever bond had once existed between mistress and servant was now shattered beyond repair. By morning, Juba was gone. Her belongings had been thrown out, and the gates that once welcomed her now closed behind her. The women of the town shook their heads as she passed, their eyes filled with disgust. Even the beggars refused to look her way. She had not just lost a home, she had lost her place among the people. For days, Adan remained in her chambers, her body weak but her mind restless. The betrayal had been more than just the food. It had been a slow poisoning of her trust, of her peace, of everything she had believed in. The elders arrived without invitation, their presence a reminder that even the strongest needed healing, not just of the body but of the spirit. "You must cleanse yourself, daughter," the eldest among them said. "This is not an illness of the flesh alone." Adan did not argue. She followed them to the healer, where the bitter herbs of the land would drive out the poison left in her body. She bathed in water mixed with leaves and ground roots, her skin tingling as the weight of Juba's deceit was washed away. Each day the darkness that had clung to her lifted, her skin regained its glow, her strength returned, and soon she could feel the fire in her spirit rekindling. Chief Naji, seeing the toll his absence had taken, became a changed man. He had once believed that as long as his home stood, all would be well inside it. He had been wrong. His wife had nearly been lost under his own roof while he had been looking elsewhere. From that day forward, he became her shadow, ensuring she was never again left alone in the care of another. His words became softer, his presence more constant, and for the first time in years, Adan felt truly seen. But the greatest change was within Adan herself. The woman who once trusted without question now watched carefully. The meals she once accepted without thought, she now prepared with her own hands. The home she had once allowed others to run, she now guarded with the wisdom of experience. As she stirred a pot of her own soup one evening, she let the warmth of the steam rise to her face. The scent was rich, the taste would be pure, untainted by hands she could not trust. She smiled to herself, a bitter but necessary lesson now etched into her heart. The greatest betrayal is not the one you see coming, but the one you invite into your home. This story was more than betrayal. It was a lesson in trust, power, and resilience. If this chilling tale kept you on edge, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping narratives. And remember, the greatest betrayals often come from those closest to us. Stay vigilant.